Yes, Mr. Stein.
Good morning, sir. A number of people have indicated that they are looking forward to these closing submissions. All I can say is, I pray I don't let you down. Let me make three basic opening points. Treatment without consent was never acceptable. Treatment without consent is no excuse for substandard care. Those who treat without consent and cause harm should be hauled up before the criminal courts. So as you're aware, my name is Sam Stein, KC, and with Miss Milligan, instructed by Milners solicitors, I appear on behalf of 23 of my clients. All of them are either infected or infected and victims of this disaster. We thank you, sir, and the inquiry team for its care, the respect with which all parties have been dealt with, and the depth of this investigation. The hard work of the entire inquiry team, its support services and structures have made this inquiry as accessible as possible and as positive an experience as it could be in the circumstances. So we also thank you and the inquiry for the clear thinking and organisational skills which meant that we heard from the victims of this scandal first and returned to victims periodically throughout. The evidence from the infected and affected, and please understand, I understand myself how clumsy and objectifying those words infected and affected are. The evidence from those people have given this inquiry the bedrock of evidence that it needed in order to understand what happened, as against the evidence from the clinicians, the bureaucrats and politicians. It should be noted, sir, that the Penrose inquiry only heard from a limited number of those infected and affected. After Penrose, the infected and affected community were left devastated by the Penrose report. The community thought that Penrose was the last shot at truth and meaningful reparations, and I know that some people wanted to give up. Mark Stewart, who I represent, thought about taking his own life. The evidence and the submissions in this, the Infected Blood Inquiry, finishes today. It will, I'm sure, take time for everyone to cope with the loss of the constant engagement and consideration of the evidence. This may feel a little like bereavement, but this community is used to that. Next, and for a moment, I want to single out for praise the inquiry legal team, led so ably by Miss Richards, King's Counsel. We thank them for the 4 years of weeks away from home and the evenings and sometimes the nights worked through to get this right. We recognize that this has not been a marathon for the inquiry legal team. Instead, this has been a series of ultra-marathons run towards what must have seemed at first to be a very dim light at the end of a very long tunnel. Now let me turn to my own small but mighty client group, who we have had the great pleasure of representing before this inquiry. We, their legal team, have learned everything from listening to you, learning about what was done to you and what you did as a result. Our clients have been infected, affected and killed by this scandal. We remember in this regard the loss of Peter Mossman, aka Mossy, an infected haemophiliac and great campaigner who died after developing a pneumonia and was buried a year ago today on February the 3rd, 2022. His son Gareth has said to the press, "My father was consumed by his need to get justice and battled for this inquiry for so long. And it makes me emotional to think the inquiry is coming to an end on the anniversary of his funeral." Gareth went on to say, "It is massively upsetting that he is not here to see it." Our clients' lives have been devastated and derailed by their and their loved ones' exposure to infected blood products. They have truly lived through the worst of times, the stigma, the fear, the endless, desperate day-to-day ill health, the pain, the brain fog, and continual sleep deprivation. Those infected and their families have been told that they won't survive their infection many a time. Mark Ward told us. Doctors told him on a number of occasions that he's going to die. Yet instead, he survives and continues his astonishing campaign to spread the word about healthy blood products to the world. Some of our clients are women who supported their partners through terminal illness, and of those few gave any thought at any time, and some were in turn infected themselves. One of our clients, the terrific Colette Wintle, has had to achieve recognition of her very own identity as a female haemophiliac, ignored and assigned to a bin of heavy women's problems, or dismissed as a carrier. Some of our clients had been misdiagnosed as haemophiliacs and then mistreated as such, cruelly infected through blood products which they never required. It would be wrong of me not to record that our misdiagnosed clients remain of the view that they have at times felt ignored by this inquiry, as it has not been about mistakes made in their treatment, but of course, how that treatment came to bear on those who received it. And so we have, you may remember at the very beginning of the inquiry, my misdiagnosed clients wore a T-shirt. I have one here. So whilst the inquiry is, of course, welcome to have it, I note that it is probably more me-sized and extra large than it is anyone else. And, of course, many of our clients are campaigners who have fought and fought and fought for justice and truth. If ignored, they knocked on another door. Like great fighters, if ever knocked down, they got straight back up. They never stopped. And without them, and this needs recognition, this inquiry would never have happened, and the government line would have prevailed. All of our clients are passionate, unrelenting, and angry, but this is a righteous anger, sir. This is the righteous anger of the ignored, the sidelined, and the discriminated. We don't apologize for our clients' visceral anger. We don't apologize for their desire for truth and for proper compensation for the damage done to them. Instead, let me be pinpoint clear, they are right to be angry, and they are right to demand compensation, right to demand change, and right to demand restitution. It has been a privilege to represent all of our clients, work with them and for them. And it is an honor to be trusted with the responsibility of, although rather nervously, with the responsibility of standing up here on their behalf. I apologize sincerely to them for sometimes not always understanding at first or getting the point only slowly at times. But I hope we got there in the end. I would also, of course, like to thank my juniors, Alan Barker of Nexus Chambers, for his hard work in the early part of this inquiry, and then more recently, the great Scarlett Milligan of my own wonderful chambers, 39 Essex. Myself and my brilliant but long-suffering solicitor, I emphasize suffering from me, that is, Mr. Harrison, who sits to my right, from the great Leeds firm Milners Solicitors, and I have had many a lively discussion over these last 4 years. He has my enduring thanks. Ben, we made it. In making these submissions, let me describe the structure of what we have to say. First of all, I will be dealing with the DHSC, Department of Health. I will probably refer to it as Department of Health. So that will be the first chapter. Then I'll move on to consent, risk, other medical choices, experimentation, and so at that juncture, with your permission, I will break. After the break, then returning with licensing, what should have happened, campaigners, recommendations, and the way forward. I have to say, sir, I'm slightly conscious that I could have come up with some snappier chapter headings. Let me deal first of all with the Department of Health. We, like others, I'm sure, awaited with interest the oral submissions to be made on behalf of the Department of Health by Miss Gray, King's Counsel, to see, after all of this time and after hearing all of this evidence, how their apology would be shaped after their opening remarks on the 28th of September of 2018. When speaking on behalf of the Department for Health and Social Care in England and its predecessor, Miss Gray, King's Counsel, said, things happened that should not have happened, and that things went wrong. Now, sir, as you'll be aware, in the Department of Health, the DHSC's written submissions, paragraph 1.7, they refer to their unreserved apology, saying as they do there, nothing in those written submissions should be seen as changing this. Unfortunately, what we got from Miss Gray on the 18th of January was, it's uniquely your role to make those findings, referring to you, sir. Miss Gray went on to say this, and we might have remained silent and made no submissions, but instead we have gathered together the perspectives of those involved at the time. Really? Was it really a choice for the Department of Health that they thought that they might have remained silent and made no submissions? After hearing the submissions from Miss Gray, I reached for the dictionary to look up the word candour, just wanting to check my own often inadequate understanding of common words. And so, as you no doubt know, it means the quality of being honest and straightforward in attitude and speech. May I compliment Miss Gray as an advocate for the high standard of her delivery of her clients' Department of Health submissions, but sadly deprecate her clients' instructions to her. And those instructions seem to be that it is the Department of Health's view that it is somehow acceptable that they can hide behind the curtain and that, as they feel, they cannot be compelled to state a case, let alone provide a meaningful apology, which references the facts established and now known to us in this inquiry. Well, sir, you put it to Miss Gray. What exactly, can you help, was it at that time referring to their opening submissions? As a matter of history, as opposed to now, what was it that the department had in mind that you were apologising for? We suggest that the Department of Health's responses have shown an absolute lack of candour and a failure by those currently within the Department of Health to realise that apologies must mean something. Restorative justice requires not just the form of an apology, but the sense to those who are being apologised to that the apology giver accepts wrongdoing. We have a proposal for the Department of Health, which we hope helps. The very long fight for truth and justice was never about the credible evidence that already existed, that the long-standing campaigners discovered and discussed and preserved, but it was about the supreme effort that went into the government, denials, lies, blocking and cancelling out of campaigners and infected and affected voices. It was always about the refusal to look at and address what was plain on the documents. So we make an offer to the Department of Health. If you, the government, Department of Health, are struggling to work out what you need to apologise for, then we have the people, we have the community, we have the survivors who will be happy to meet with you anytime, any place to have that discussion. But in the light of the empty apology, we suggest and agree with my own friend Mr. Dawson, King's Counsel submissions, that any reading of the Department of Health's closing written submissions shows that, in fact, it leans towards an attempt to provide a defence for the Department of Health. Let me look at a couple of points. Firstly, the Department of Health suggests that the years have taken their toll on recollections, suggesting, paragraph 1.16, Department of Health written closing, that of the effect of time on memory, that, I quote, such limitations affect the memories of all those heard in this inquiry, whether former ministers, officials, doctors, or patients. Secondly, that again, due to the passage of time, the documentary record will be incomplete. You'll find that, sir, at paragraph 1.17. Well, sir, I doubt whether any single patient who suffered the long consequences of their infections appreciates being told that time has dimmed their recollections. Our clients and this community has not forgotten about what the doctors told them or didn't tell them. They've not forgotten about the fact of their infection or the way they learnt of their infection or multiple infections or being told that they will not survive or the hammer blow of letters in relation to VCJD or the deaths. We suggest that the community has not forgotten those points to the Department of Health. Let me be clear, this response from the Department of Health is simply a demonstration of the latest government line used to fob off the survivors of this tragedy. But in taking the latest version of the government line, the apology at the beginning of this inquiry now appears contrived, and the lack of true acceptance of fault is disrespectful to everyone and to Lord Morris's comment about blood products, that this is the worst treatment disaster in the 75-year history of the NHS. If nothing else, this perpetuation of harm should be considered an aggravating factor in the compensation decisions and deliberation. Now, no doubt my PI lawyer friends will tell me after my speech how far that is actually possible. I turn now to consent. We have witnessed in this inquiry the evidence given by all of the haemophiliacs and family members and all of the witnesses about their treatment with infected blood products. We hope and believe that the inquiry is likely to accept the overwhelming preponderance of evidence from the patients and their families, which shows that haemophiliacs were not properly informed and were not provided with sufficient information to make an informed choice as to whether they, and they is the important word, isn't it, as to whether they, the patient, was prepared to take a risk. Consent, sir, is about and always has been about the ownership of risk. On the 17th of January of this year, we heard the careful submissions from Mr. Bragg, an individual who had been infected with hepatitis as a result of a blood transfusion. Mr. Bragg, because of his work, referred to the employment of risk analysis within the regulatory world. And in truth, that is what both regulation and medical treatment is all about. Risk is one of the, if not the main issue, to be considered, monitored and reconsidered with regularity as part of a doctor's or indeed regulator's function. The questions are always, what is the risk? What is the degree of risk? Changes in risk, and what can be done to ameliorate risk or avoid it entirely? So how should risk analysis have been addressed for haemophiliacs when considering the treatment using blood concentrates? Well, first of all, there needs to be consideration of the severity of the condition of the patient who will suffer the consequences and side effects of any treatment. Now, for haemophiliacs, we have broad and rather crude labels for the severity of haemophilia. Those are mild, moderate, and severe. Those labels are an attempt to describe the effect on an individual of the condition. Mild haemophilia, 6 to 50% factor level, may only have minor bleeding problems. Moderate haemophilia, 1 to 5% factor level, may bleed 1 time per month. Severe haemophilia, less than 1% factor level, may bleed 1 or 2 times per week. Now, myself and Ms. Milligan and Mr. Harrison have learnt that using these labels to describe the individual's lived experience of haemophilia is a mistake. Some haemophiliacs with so-called mild haemophilia experience a much more severe response to bleeds than might be expected from that label, mild haemophilia. And so it is always about the experience of the individual rather than any broad or brushstroke attempt to provide a label. So as ever with risk, the analysis should be based upon risk of treatment through the use of blood concentrates, or indeed any blood product for any recipient, and then analyze for that recipient. In short, should this treatment be provided for this patient? The decision about treatment should therefore be what treatments are available for this patient. What are the benefits of each of the available treatments for this patient? What are the harms which may be the result of any specific treatment? Is there a treatment which may be less effective but less risky? Overall, do the benefits outweigh the harm? And of course, the big question: what is the decision of the patient or the patient's guardian when properly informed of these questions? Now, the decision by doctors as to their view regarding treatment and the decisions made by patients may change over time as knowledge changes and as products change, options change, or may become more limited. Sometimes it's useful to think about not only the evidence we've heard, but the absence of evidence. What evidence have we seen that reflects upon discussions with patients about the relative severity of their haemophilia and how that affects treatment options or of medical advice? What evidence have we seen or heard which shows us that the patients had discussions with their haematologists about the use of blood products, commercial products, blood pools, and the growth of medical understanding? If we think back, very little, if any, at all. Now, we listened on the 19th of January of this year to submissions from Mr. Kennedy, King's Counsel, on behalf of the UK CDHO. And he included the point that patients are much more prepared to ask questions than they were in the 70s, when there was a more paternalistic approach. And that you can also take account, sir, he said, and I paraphrase, of the patient protections from organisations such as NICE. So we suggest that this is and remains a submission that could only be made by a doctors' group. Not all patients are able to ask questions. Not all patients are confident enough to ask questions, and not all patients know what questions should be asked. It also misses the point. In this scandal, the patients, if told anything, were not told the truth. The British Medical Association publication Professional Standards, a statement prepared by a special panel appointed by the Board of Science and Education of the British Medical Association, so I will give on occasions relativity references. I don't expect them to come up on the screen. I have some points to go on the screen, and Lawrence knows them as we go through. The reference for that is BMA L 5082, page 9. So this document from the BMA, Professional Standards document, in the early 70s, discussed the need for patients to maintain good communication and exchanging information to patients, and of course maintaining patient confidentiality. So have we found within this evidence over these years any real explanation of why obtaining consent for treatment was ignored? There are, we suggest, some pointers. At WITN 343702, page 24, Dr. Winter says, he says this, that relevant to this is that the nature of haematology training changed in the mid-70s. Prior to this, haematologists had been trained in laboratories. But under the new system, haematology training required postgraduate experience of general medicine and the passing of the Royal College of Physicians exam. When viral contamination issues emerged, he went on to say, some centres were managed by doctors with very limited experience in breaking bad news. In his evidence to the Archer inquiry, Dr. Winter made a similar point at page 90 of the transcript. He said this, haemophilia was really a branch of pathology prior to that, and the senior haemophilia doctors had worked in laboratories. They were gifted academics, they were scientists. They were not experienced in, for instance, dealing with very sick people. In her interview for the Royal College of Physicians Oral History Project, Professor Lee said of researchers, she spoke in this way about researchers, that you'd be wasted on medicine, she said. Tell me more about that, she was asked. Well, she said, I think that people who did pure science, and particularly at that time biochemistry was pretty new science, regarded medicine as rather a simpler option, really, a less scientific option. Reference to that is MACK 000 2586. So there may have been a tension in haematology between those of a more scientific background and those trained primarily as physicians. Part of this issue may be that haematologists came from a pathology background, meaning that they did not come from a patient treating background. Such a tension could and might explain some of the differences in treatments administered by haematologists, Dr. Dormady at the Royal Free, as an example, or the fact that some physicians, Dr. Winter is an example of this, made early switches to heat-treated products based on their assessment of the evidence at the time, whereas others, I'm being generous, perhaps more rooted in scientific backgrounds, were slower to move away from what were the obvious and better treatment options. It is possible that differences in haematologists may have arisen because those trained as physicians were more focused on the condition of their patients, whereas those whose training was rooted in pure science might have been more inclined to wait until facts had been established to a scientific standard of proof. Let's have a look at 1973. Bearing all of those points in mind, let's have a look at 1973. And Lawrence, this is the first of the documents, please, on screen. WITN 1055172. So this is a letter from Dr. Jones at the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre to Mr. and Mrs. Longstaff, the parents of Peter Longstaff, who grew up and married Carol Grayson. A small point, but a point I'll refer to later on in these submissions. Top right-hand corner, obviously the heading Newcastle Haemophilia Centre, Attic Laboratory. 12th April is the date, 1973. Now, I'll refer a few times to Peter Jones. He's a name that's familiar to all. He didn't give evidence. There are reasons for that. But he was a significant person and a significant doctor, a significant individual within the UK CDHO. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Longstaff, I'm sorry you could not come to the last clinic, and I enclose another appointment. You will have received a letter from Lord Mayor Treloar asking for your permission for Peter to participate in the special trial of regular factor VIII injections, referring to other individuals. Parents have also been asked for their permission. I saw, then again redacted, I saw them last week and explained that I was in complete agreement with the trial and that it could do nothing but good for the boys and for other patients. Then the sales job. it has been most carefully worked out, was discussed at the last meeting of the haemophilia directors in Oxford, and has the support of the Medical Research Council of the United Kingdom. I would, of course, be extremely happy to discuss any points that concern you about the trial when I see you, but wonder if you would feel able to sign the acceptance form for Lord Mayor Trelaw at this stage. I saw the doctors concerned in London yesterday, and they are trying to get things organised for next term. Nothing but good. 1973. That's what's being explained. I turn now to my chapter heading, which is risk. So, a risk is a risk is a risk. You have been addressed in differing ways, trying to discuss with you, sir, how to address the question of risk. Most, if not all, treatments carry a risk of harm. Any over-the-counter medication will also carry a long explanation in the tiniest of writing, detailing the known possible, common and less common side effects. Those are risks. With blood products, there is no need for debate. It was always known that blood products bring with them the risk of hepatitis. I repeat, a risk is a risk is a risk. The words possible risk or its cousin, potential risk, add nothing to the debate. Clinicians knew of the risk from blood products. Professor Tuddenham explained, WITN 343-5002, page 14. When I first began to treat people with haemophilia at Liverpool Royal Infirmary in 1969, my senior registrar told me the tragic story of a patient with severe haemophilia A who had resisted being treated with cryoprecipitate because of a fear of hepatitis. He had come in with severe bleeding, and my colleague convinced him to have cryoprecipitate infusions. They controlled the bleeding, but the patient developed hepatitis and dies. From that time, I was well aware of the potentially fatal consequences of treating haemophilia with blood products, and that the risk increased with donor exposure. Those risks could not have been more clearly expressed than by Richard Titmuss in his book The Gift Relationship in 1970. Chapter 8, page 142. To the recipient, the use of human blood for medical purposes could be more lethal than many drugs. The use of certain blood products carries with it the risk of transmitting disease, particularly serum hepatitis. It goes on to then refer to malaria, syphilis, and brucellosis. It then says this. In the United States, Britain, and other modern societies, the most dangerous of these hazards is serum hepatitis. It is becoming a major public health problem throughout the world. No scientific means have as yet been found to detect in the laboratory the causative agents or agents in the blood before it is used for a transfusion or for conversion into blood products. The quantity of infected blood that can transmit hepatitis may be as little as 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter. The risk from contaminated blood and blood products leading to hepatitis were well known for years within the medical profession. Another example, in 43, it's referred to in fact, FACT 5 in 1943. Medical officers of the Ministry of Health published a memorandum on homologous serum jaundice, in which they stated any doubt as to the reality of the association is removed by the frequency with which hepatitis has followed the injection of human blood products. The danger was recognized to be particularly acute in pooled plasma products. In journals in 1946, RLIT 5052, where it was recommended that pooled plasma should not be used prophylactically, and only small pools should be used for transfusion purposes. A further article in 1947, RLIT 5054, physicians are advised that transfusion therapies should only be administered when the clinical indications are absolute. In 1966, RLIT 001219, in the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, reported a high incidence of hepatitis transmitted to patients who had been given whole blood or blood products. 68, Professor Zuckerman's letter to the BMJ, titled The Price of Blood, warning of the dangers of using paid donors and the greatly increased hepatitis risk. Reference LD OW 40210, page 2. Mr. Aldworth, King's Counsel, submitted in the morning of the 27th of January of this year that paternalistic attitudes may have been at least a partial basis in the clinicians believing that they should spare the patients the worry about the consequences of hepatitis. And he argued, I put it in my terms, that it was only after the studies in the later 70s, which he suggests revealed the longer-term effects of hepatitis, that doctors became more generally aware of the risks. Now, there have been some other submissions made from this lectern saying that it was only in the later 70s that there was this increased awareness of the risk within the profession. Now, why is that submission being made? Well, presumably the point of making a submission which is that the awareness of risk grew in the later 70s is that the blame and culpability should be considered as having a late starting point after the studies, which related to biopsies concerned with liver damage, Preston, and the like. It seems that from those submissions so the inquiry is being pointed in the direction of a finding that with the growth of knowledge, or we presume at least the availability of knowledge of these facts, that it is from that stage the failings which had been wrapped up in the warm comfort blanket of the paternalistic attitude designed to protect patients from the truth really started to hit patients. We reject those arguments. They fall away against the strong body of evidence that there was a general knowledge set out in detail within the inquiry presentations, within the material that has been long sought through the diligent work of campaigners and preserved, which demonstrates that blood and blood products were well known to be dangerous well before licensing and the common use of blood concentrates. Clinicians did know that the risk from use of blood and blood products was real. They always knew that. They did know that the risk was serious. They did know that from the get-go, that infection with hepatitis might mean death or serious illness. Blood and blood products have long been known to pose a risk of death, a killing risk. We ask instead that the inquiry, that you, sir, find that in those early days, the medical risks to patients were known. Now, of course, there was a manifestation and the use of the moniker non-A, non-B, and the later turning to Hep C. Interestingly, though, Dr. Wallace in Edinburgh, in his book about blood transfusion, was already referring to it as hepatitis C in, I think, 1975, 1976. Now, what was going on, we suggest, was always an enormous experiment in treatment on haemophiliacs. Now, that doesn't absolve the doctors and clinicians from responsibility, but instead emphasizes the responsibility to inform the patient. In other words, the responsible treating physician at the time should have said, if they believed that blood concentrates was the right treatment, they should have said, we think that these products will treat your haemophilia, but there are very real risks of infection with hepatitis, which can sometimes be serious and which might kill you faster than non-treatment or treatment with other options. The point has been raised in the Department of Health submissions, and indeed by Mr. Corey Wright, King's Counsel on behalf of the Blood Transfusion Service, that access to materials, research materials and the like, was more limited in the past. Okay. Now there is a limited point to be made here. It is right that perhaps obscure journals from remote parts of the world might not have been as accessible as they are now using the power of the internet and the advent of digital libraries. But most of the literature that we have considered, and has been considered by this inquiry, has been mainstream. And we are talking about specialists in the field, hematologists. Three examples of the many well-known publications or hard-to-miss sources of information. Prince, M, and others in 1974, his article, Long Incubation Post-Transfusion Hepatitis Without Serological Evidence of Exposure to Hepatitis A virus, in The Lancet. Krask, 1975, reporting a rise from 3 to 50% of his patients among his group of patients with haemophilia, with 58 being infected and 2 deaths. An outbreak of hepatitis associated with intravenous injection of factor VIII concentrate, reported clearly in The Lancet. Wider information available to all. In 1975, the World in Action documentary travelled with hepatitis expert Ari Zuckerman to the US to look at the types of donors being used in what was described as Skid Row plasma donation clinics. Zuckerman noted that these were donors that the UK would have rejected straight away due to safety issues, describing them as an affront to human dignity. Issues such as the greater incidence of infection from the use of pooled blood or the increase in numbers contributing to the pool were discussed in the past, leading up to the 70s. The leading haemophilia doctors were aware of this and discussed it amongst themselves. I turn to my next document to go on the screen, which Lawrence, fingers crossed, should be NTHT 5055. Thank you. So as we can see, this is a discussion about management of haemophilias. Second and third meetings of the European Home Therapy Group held in Newcastle upon Tyne 76, Madrid 78, edited by Peter Jones and J. Martin Villa. Reference also to the Scandinavian Journal of Haematology, supplement number something. And can I then, Lawrence, please go. I think you have the right page, 62, please, on the screen. And it's the bottom 2 paragraphs, if you could highlight those. Great. The first paragraph helps us, and this tells us what should have been discussed with patients, the whys and wherefores, what is useful to know. So set out here, reference to Dr. I assume, I'm going to say this name very badly wrong, I'm sure, Penny Cutie. The widespread use of plasma fractions in the home and hospital treatment of haemophiliacs has brought not only advantages, but also a significant disadvantage. Factor VIII or 9 activity is much greater in freeze-dried concentrates than in cryoprecipitate or plasma. They are also more stable and have a much more predictable action. Concentrates do not produce the allergic reactions which sometimes occur with cryo or plasma. They have made home treatment practical and major operations on haemophiliacs easier, much easier. These concentrates, however, which are prepared from pools of more than 1,000 units, may expose the patients to a high risk of contracting transfusion hepatitis. Random observations during routine examinations revealed a high incidence of elevated liver enzymes in relation to haemophilia. 112 of our patients with severe haemophilia A or B and 24 with mild or moderate forms were studied to determine the incidence of liver damage, which may have resulted from blood product therapy. Physical and biochemical examinations were performed on all patients at 3 and 6 months intervals. Most of them had been heavily exposed to commercial concentrates. Only 4 patients had never received concentrates, whereas 23 had received concentrate on more than 100 occasions. Acute hepatitis with jaundice was found in 23 patients, 12 children, and so on. In a nutshell, this discussion embodies either the reason why blood concentrates should not have been used, or what should have been explained to patients so that they can make their choice. Now, I've considered with you, sir, the evidence of knowledge of risk and the dangers of infection with hepatitis. But how well was the risk of hepatitis from blood products known more generally within the medical profession? In other words, is there a possibility that it could have been missed by some doctors, even though this was their special area of work? Now, this is why we've had these submissions about the lack of internet access, limited availability of communications, and the slowness of snail mail. That they want a finding, sir, from the inquiry that doctors had a limited knowledge of this matter. But the evidence tells us that the dangers of hepatitis being transmitted through blood or blood products was absolutely the stuff of common medical knowledge. The notes of the meeting of the Hepatitis Advisory Group refer to their discussions on the 11th of January 1971 at Alexander Fleming House, reference DHSC 40114. I quote, Professor Duguid observed that the hepatitis hazard was not only an anxiety for renal units, it was a matter for the whole hospital and others to concern themselves with. Communication was vital and material to be communicated. It therefore followed that records of tests and incidents should be kept assiduously. He undertook to prepare a passage for the report in this sense. The document also refers to a comment by Sir Michael Woodruff, who suggested that as regards renal units, ideally he would like to have 3 areas in the unit: white, yellow for confirmed cases, and grey for suspects, especially new cases. Going on to say that the grey area might use peritoneal dialysis. Within that document, there is a question raised, if you care, sir, to look at it, about whether nurses that had been employed in renal units which had found to, in fact, carry an infection should then be employed in units which were described as maiden units, those that didn't have or haven't had an infection. So that there's clear knowledge within the wider medical profession of the dangers of hepatitis. And of course, you'll recall the recollections that have been addressed earlier on with other submissions of Dr. Winter. I now refer to Dr. Tuddenham. Sorry, you've already been referred to the recollections of Dr. Winter, and indeed I've referred to Dr. Tuddenham. I now make reference to Dr. Lowe's statement at paragraph 7.1, WITN 3496013. Dr. Lowe said this: As I stated at the Penrose inquiry, and he refers to his own transcript of that at PRSE 0006080, I recalled that routinely laboratory products and request forms from patients who had received blood products had yellow dangerous specimen labels applied. Paragraph 27 of his statement. Dr. Lowe said this: As a clinical medical student in 1970 to 1972, I was taught about hepatitis A and B. I recall that one of our questions in the final examination in medicine in 1972 was write an essay on hepatitis. As a house officer in 72 to 74, I was taught the risks of transmission of hepatitis, including hepatitis B, from blood products. It was Dr. Lowe who referred in the statement at paragraph 23.1 and who recalled the reference to hepatitis in Colin Douglas's book, The Houseman's Tale, a copy of which I have here. That was first published in 1975. The author, Dr. Douglas, graduated in medicine at the University of Edinburgh in 1970. His book includes a reference to a clinician colleague who Dr. Campbell, the main character in the book, visited. Page 198. Campbell hurried along to the isolation unit, a building on its own beyond the coke dumps and the disused tennis courts. And he continues in this book, describing the building as having been taken over by a specialist medical unit to provide intensive care and barrier nursing facilities for dangerously infected patients. On arrival, the fictional character in the book, Dr. Campbell, put on a disposable mask, overshoes, a gown, a white unfestive paper hat and a face mark. In the book, it's Christmas time. The book continues and describes the patient. Mac was sitting up in his cubicle, smiling and faintly jaundiced. "Welcome to the pest house. They tell me I've got the yellow peril and it'll be 6 months off the booze." Which of the yellow perils is it?" Campbell asked. "Plain or fancy?" There were two types of hepatitis, one of which killed people. Serum hepatitis did and was less common, but more likely to occur among hospital staff. Max said this: "They're running a test now, but from the way they're treating me, I'd say that it's the real fancy, no messing about, nasty serum stuff. They're taking no chances. You know, Ivor, the SHO here, came at me for blood, dressed like a deep-sea diver. You know, bootlets, gauntness, a thing like a welder's mask on. It made me feel I wasn't nice to know." Now, that's not the first time that transmission of hepatitis in blood-borne viruses was or had been referred to in a medical comedy. In MASH, the American series based in the Korean War, Series 1, Episode 11, that was titled Germ Warfare, in which a transfusion of blood from Major Burns is suspected of having transmitted serum hepatitis to a patient, giving rise to comedic attempts to stop Major Burns associating with Major Houlihan, or attempting to operate as a surgeon. The date of that broadcast and that episode was the 10th of December 1972. Submissions which attempt to say that the non-existence of the internet and digital library resources until much later in the 20th century hamper our understanding, or that we must be wary of hindsight, reference to the Department of Health's written submissions 1.23 onwards. Those submissions must, we say, be reviewed with care. First, that some of the earliest materials identifying the connection between jaundice and blood products came, in fact, from the Ministry of Health, as it then was, and not, as it seems that some of the closing submissions are attempting to say, from some type of obscure, hard-to-get-at, unrecognisable source. Second, doctors have expressed before this inquiry their very own real understanding of risk from blood which may cause a serious and potentially fatal hepatitis from the earliest days of their practice. And third, it was of such common knowledge that fictional sources, medical dramas, demonstrate that this was common knowledge, both in the UK and the United States. It was wrong to leave patients without an explanation about the possible consequences of infection. The fact that we know, as we've gone through, that hospitals themselves clearly viewed the risk of potential harm from hepatitis to be serious, and that they took steps themselves to warn each other of the dangers of blood that is just drawn from people with haemophilia, demonstrates, we suggest, a clear double standard. Patients needed to be told. The fact that hepatitis was a risk to the patient and a risk of onwards transmission should have been discussed with that particular patient at that time to say, not only is this a risk to you, but there is a potential risk to your loved ones and others. We suggest that that was a clear duty that existed and always existed. But having identified the risk of hepatitis, how was that translated into patient care? Well, we've heard from the patients in their evidence about how they were not informed of the risks or that it was minimised. So what contemporary evidence exists from the clinician point of view, describing and setting out what it is that they would want to say? I go please now to Lawrence RLIT 50, I think, 41 _ triple. Thank you. Now, so the book on the screen is the, from Relativity, is the first edition, 1974, of this book, which I'm holding in my right hand, which is the second edition, I think, 1984. If I could then go, please, very shortly to the sixth page, Lawrence RLT, same reference. Thank you very much. A very small point. We can see, first of all, that the book is dated 74, and in reference to the letter to Peter Longstaff's parents we looked at earlier, you'll see the top right-hand corner of that actually referred to the attic lab. Well, here this book was dedicated to those individuals and to the attic lab where it all began, So I take us now, please, to page 79, 0079, bottom right-hand corner. Thank you. Chapter 5 is headed, we can see, Chapter 5 headed Treatment 1, Therapeutic Materials. Most of the materials used in the treatment of bleeding disorders are derived from human blood. This is provided by voluntary donors and is collected by a transfusion service, which may be local or national. In the United Kingdom, the donors receive no payment for their generosity. The blood is taken at special sessions, arranged in localities suitable for the majority of donors in a particular area. These might be factories, universities, church halls, or recreation centres. Donors already enrolled in the area will often be notified of the session, but new donors are always welcome. In order to give blood, a donor must be an adult in good form and not known to carry communicable disease. We can go down that page, please, Lawrence. And the bottom page 73, as we see on the screen, if you could highlight after a session onwards, please. Thank you. After a session, the labelled packs of blood are taken in a refrigerated van to the central laboratories of the transfusion service. Here they go through a series of stringent tests to exclude infection, including serum hepatitis, and to make sure that the blood groups on the labels are correct. In 1984, jumping ahead, same book. Same paragraph, Treatment 1, Therapeutic Materials. Page 81, this is not going to go on the screen. Most of the materials used in the treatment of bleeding disorders are still derived from human blood. Lawrence, if we take off that off the screen, it'll probably help. So the 1984, same book, version. Most of the materials used in the treatment of bleeding disorders are still derived from human blood. This is provided by either voluntary or paid donors, and is collected by a transfusion service which may be local or national. In several countries, including the United Kingdom, the donors receive no payment for their generosity. In other countries, most especially in the United States, donors are paid modest amounts for their blood plasma, which is then processed by one of the commercial companies. And a very similar paragraph to the one we looked at in the 1974 version. After a session, the labelled packs of blood are taken in a refrigerated van to the central laboratories of the transfusion service. Here they go through a series of stringent tests to exclude infection, including serum hepatitis, and to make sure that the blood groups on the labels are correct. That's 1984. We say this in our written submissions. Paragraph 334 at page 112. We made reference at that stage in our written submission to the 1974 book, but I suggested it applies equally to the 84 book. A reader would be forgiven for understanding this chapter to say that factor concentrates used in the UK were sourced from British volunteer donors whose blood had been screened to all but exclude the risk of hepatitis. In fact, at the point of publication in 1974, two commercial products, Bacter's Hemofil and Immuno's Cryobuline, had been licensed, both sourced from foreign paid donors and both manufactured from pools well in excess of several donors. Even NHS pools, we say, were several hundred rather than several donations in size by the time of the publication. Now, these books were written for the families of haemophiliacs, for haemophiliacs to understand about their treatment. They were deliberately designed for that purpose. So when you consider everyone's evidence against the contemporaneous materials published by an eminent and very well-known haematologist, setting out the advice of patients in his published works, we suggest that doctors routinely fail to advise haemophiliacs as to the inherent dangers of this type of treatment, despite the fact that they and the rest of the medical profession knew of the risks. I started with three particular points. May I emphasize the second one? We suggest that the issue of failure of consent needs to be considered for what it is. If any doctor, at any time or date, proceeds to treat without consent, that emphasizes the burden on the doctor to get it right, and get it right for that patient, and get it right given the state of medical knowledge, not to get it wrong, not to muck it up. What some have referred to as a paternalistic approach to consent appears at times to have been equated with doctors having a license to give poor treatment, or, as Miss Milligan would have me say, treatment which falls below the standard of a reasonably competent medical practitioner. That is not and cannot be right. If somehow you choose to treat someone without their consent, then this means the onus is on you to get it right, not just the treatment itself, but the choice of treatment. In taking choice and information away from a patient, in deciding to take their decision for them, you assume responsibility for the appropriateness of that treatment and for the consequences of getting that risk-benefit analysis wrong. This was done, as we know, many, many times in the general treatment of haemophiliacs and the misdiagnosed, many of whom should never have been exposed to the risks posed by blood concentrates. We repeat, lack of consent is not an excuse for lack of care. So other medical choices. So what were the possible medical choices? Catherine Dormady, Dr. Dormady ran an apparently successful home treatment program from the Royal Free using cryoprecipitate until 1978. In his statement, WITN 3496013, Professor Gordon Noe said, for treatment or prevention of a bleed in such patients, I said that the combination of desmopressin and the response to injury, which also raises levels of factor VIII or von Willebrand factor, often allows us to not to have to give blood products. In evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, Dr. Brian Colvin discussed how treatment with concentrates was more fashionable than using cryoprecipitate. He stood by this and repeatedly emphasized this view during his evidence to the inquiry, this inquiry. His evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal, Dr. Colvin said this: it was certainly my policy to try to give children cryoprecipitate, because children are small and they can be treated with perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 donor units of cryoprecipitate. I think there was a feeling amongst some haemophilia treaters that the cryoprecipitate approach was rather old-fashioned, and indeed, many ways, perhaps it was. But I think us trying to use cryoprecipitate not to prevent HIV infection, but to try to limit the amount of non-A, non-B infection in my children's community. An example of what happened instead, of course, is that I use, if I may, a reference to Miss Colette Wintle, a teenager in 1976, supposed to be on cryoprecipitate. It's typed in her notes, a reference to cryoprecipitate, struck through, instead replaced with a reference to factor 8. And given after that point hemophil, possibly one of the most dangerous of the products at that time. Another example, Peter Longstaff, Grayson's husband, a severe haemophiliac, was treated successfully throughout his early life with cryoprecipitate. In this inquiry, we have all too often concentrated on the question of consent, when in fact we should have been thinking in terms of patient choice. The evidence tells us that haemophiliacs believed that they were being treated by compassionate doctors who only had their best interest at heart. The haemophilia centres and their haemophiliac patients became part of each other's lives. And we heard evidence, didn't we, about social events and family events attended by haemophilia staff members, haemophilia clinic staff members. I suggest it must feel to the victims of this scandal, the haemophiliac victims of this scandal, and indeed others, a greater betrayal, that there cannot be a greater betrayal of trust, sir, because of what they perceived was the special relationship they had with their doctors. This closeness also attacks the patrician discussions that have been presented to you, as it might be thought that the very close relationship between these doctors and their patients should have demanded truth and clarity in medical advice. This isn't the situation that we saw in the Carry On films of, was it Dr. Lancelot Pratt, wandering around doing his clinic in his rounds. That distance between consultant and patient. This is the haemophilia consultants themselves engaging very closely with their patients, knowing that people had families and indeed meeting their families. And they knew, therefore, that when treating an individual about the risks of haemophilia, not only for the transmission to the individual, but the concern that was expressed across all medical literature as to the onward transmission to others. Now, we accept there's no actual evidence that haematologists had money paid into Swiss bank accounts, or that they sat down with a large brandy in hand and plotted the extermination of haemophiliacs. So what on earth were they thinking? We believe that they fell in love with blood concentrates. They were seduced by it. It was easy to use, and it was, on the face of it, effective as a treatment. Can we have on screen, please, the image factor 8 JPG, please? Here it is, teeming with infectivity. I'm not sure in this inquiry that we've looked at a bottle of factor 8 before, and so you know my practice background. I come from a criminal defence practice background. So for me, this has been a little like doing a case without looking at the murder weapon. Its very medical appearance is part of its seductive qualities. For the haematologists, the revolution which started with cryoprecipitate was complete. The lives, they thought, and the lifespan of haemophiliacs had changed. This was referred to, at least at some stages in the evidence, as the golden period, the theory being that no longer would haemophiliacs drop down dead from the near mythological brain bleed. It seems likely that so entranced with this new and seemingly great treatment that they ignored the screamingly obvious. This treatment will, not maybe, but will expose the patient to whatever disease was in the blood of the person who gave that evidence, who gave that blood. And when you start moving to the very large, to pooled blood, you reach a stage where the evidence tells us that there was essentially a certainty of infection. So I have a note from Mr. Harrison saying this may be an appropriate time to have our break. The next section will take more than 5 minutes.
This is other choices.
This is I'm moving on to experimentation, so I'm slightly
Very well.
behind.
Well, let's take the break now then, shall we?
Yes, sir.
And come back at 20 to 12.
Yes, sir.
20 to 12.